QITalktime. It's Tuesday, the 4th of May, and I hope everyone is okay after a very stormy bank holiday Monday. Today we have a great session. Our session is by Zuneera Khurshid, and we are going to look at her piece of her work, Nothing Like a Crisis to Get Things Done, and its storytelling and experiences of quality improvement during COVID-19. And today, really, part of Zuneera's work is honouring and acknowledging the experiences of stories and healthcare staff and how COVID-19 changed the context of quality improvement in the healthcare system and enabled rapid changes. So today, one of the very important thing about our sessions is that they are as interactive as possible. So if you're listening, if you're watching by a video and the sound isn't great, you have an option as well to dial in for better sound. You can dial in using our number 015260058, and the event number is 183-005-3898 hash. Okay, so some people prefer to dial in as well as watch online because sometimes the sound is generally better. So don't hesitate to dial in if you want to. We have a chat box function, and you can see it down in the bottom corner. It's a tiny little blue bubble. So what we want to do for this session is answer any of your queries or address your comments throughout the webinar. So please put any comments, ideas into the chat box throughout the session. Okay, and that's that little blue bubble. If you click on that, you'll have the opportunity to type in your questions, comments, or queries. So we're also, please note, we will be recording this webinar and it will then be available on our website. So if you type in QITalktime into Google, it usually comes up, or go into our website, www.qualityimprovement.ie, and you will see the option to click on QITalktime, and it's down on the right-hand side. Twitter, we're very active on Twitter, so at QITalktime is our handle. So if you would like to tweet, we would love to see your tweets, and if you'd love to take a photograph, we'd love to see a lovely photo, and you can tweet that. So we were also increasingly, our QITalktime membership is growing. So if this is your first webinar, you're very, very welcome. And again, at the very end, we're going to ask for some short feedback. So when we come to the end of the session, you will find, we'll tell you that a small little window will pop up before you log out. But don't log out straight away when we finish, because we have also some exciting news to tell you in relation to the Q community. We will look at that, and then we will then allow you to finish. Now we're going to move on now, and our speaker today. So our speaker today is Zuneera Khurshid, and Zuneera is a PhD candidate at the Centre of Research, Education and Innovation at the School of Nursing and Midwifery and Health Systems at UCD, University College Dublin. And she is completing her PhD in collaboration with the National QI team. Now, on our panel, we have 4 people on our panel this afternoon. We have Dr. John Fitzsimons. John is a consultant pediatrician at Temple Street Children's Hospital, and he's also the clinical director with the HSC Quality Improvement Team. And he is course co-director with the HSC RCPI QI and leadership team. We also then have Aoife de Broom, and Aoife is an assistant professor at the Centre of Research, Education and Innovation at UCD. We have Khalil Coyle, who is a stakeholder engagement lead with the HSC Communications, and Khalil was previously deputy head of HSC Values and Action. And then also we have Vera Kelly, and Vera Kelly is a general manager in the Organisation Design and Development, and she's also the National HR lead for Staff Engagement and Culture. So our panelists, we welcome them as well today. So now what I will do is we will hand you over to Zuneera, and she will go through her presentation. So thank you and welcome, Zuneera.
Thank you, Denise. I hope everyone can see my screen now. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for inviting me here today for this session. And good afternoon, everybody. Today I will be talking about my research, which is about which we've titled like nothing like a crisis to get things done, and it is trying to make sense of the storytelling and experiences of QI during COVID-19. So just a brief outline of my session. I'll start off with an overview of the methods, then I'll talk about some of the stories that we've collected, and then I'll move on to the lessons that we've learned. Moving on to the methodology part. So the reason behind we looking into the stories and collecting the stories was that, to try and give staff a chance to express their views and their thoughts, and offer more of a cathartic experience to them to share their experiences. And secondly, as you know, the pandemic doesn't really discriminate between personal and professional life. So it was really important to study the QI and rapid changes within the context of, their overall experience. So where we looked for these stories was in Twitter and in the Health Matters magazine as well. So we looked for stories that met these 7 criteria, which are, it was related to a healthcare team. There were changes in service provision, ensuring continuity of service, innovative ideas, teamwork, leadership, QI, and person-centered care. So we collaborated. It's a collaboration between a UCD and the national and the HSC. So there are various different teams from the HSE that participated, and together we listed these stories, voted on these stories, and from the initial 1,048 stories that we had, we filtered down to 41 stories that we contacted people for recruitment. And now we've collected around 19 stories from 20 people. And what I'm going to do is talk about 4 of these stories. The first story I have, before I start with the stories, I just like to clarify that I'll be using pseudonyms, and I'll just refer to hospitals generally rather than going into details of the organization. So the first story is set in a university hospital, and it's about the development of a staff communication app. So this story was shared with us by 2 people, Clifton and Sydney. So they work in the communications department of that university hospital, and generally the communications department plays an important role in communicating information to staff. And in terms of QI, they're also responsible for dealing, the communications and information element of QI projects as well. So when COVID hit, what happened was that there was a need for a solution that could very quickly communicate information specifically related to COVID. There was so much information, flying around in the media as well. Most of it wasn't true. So there was a need for a channel for an authentic information. So what they did was they went and they talked among the team members, and they came up with an idea that, to develop a staff app that could quickly communicate that information. So they went in with a very focused approach, rather than thinking about coming up with a very broad app with different functionalities. They focused only on the COVID information. They came up with an app, and they did that the entire process from the idea till getting the permissions and actually getting it done, and within 2 weeks. So that was a very short time. And as you can see, within the first 10 days of the app going live, there were more than 2,000 verified users on the app, which shows that there was a great need for information around COVID. So, between the different surges and the waves of the pandemic, the team got a chance to reflect on their learning from this experience, and they've been thinking about how they can keep using the app, keep it relevant, keep using it, and keep it useful for staff. So they've thinking about how they can turn it into a proactive tool and try to incorporate more areas, such as, for example, HR information as well into that app. Moving on. So the second story we have is that was shared to us by Florence, who is a speech and language therapist. But during COVID, she was redeployed into the contact management program. So there was an urgent need to establish, a national contact test and trace service at a national level. So for that, although that's a very big program and it has, very different aspects. So Florence was supporting in the scripts and scenarios and developing resources for contact tracers. And it was mainly led by the QI methodology as well. So they went in with the approach that, implement a solution and then refining it gradually, looking at, learning from the experience and then gradually refining the solution that was being offered. And another important aspect was that it was very much patient centered or person centered. So in developing, for example, the scripts and scenarios, what they did was that, it was actually revised based on the actual calls that were made to people. They tried to incorporate as many scenarios as they could. So what they did was that, they tried to look at it from the perspective of the people who would be receiving the calls. So that was a very important aspect of it. And if you look at the quote here, it says, "It's not perfect. It was never going to be perfect, but I do think it's a really valuable tool in the response." So the takeaway from here is that, they didn't really try to go in with a perfect solution. They tried to just start and then using the QI methodology, gradually refine and improve the solution that was being offered. Moving on to the third story, it was shared to us by Dakota, who works in a hospice. So she is an occupational therapist and she is involved in the care of older persons. So they did have some inpatients during the time of COVID, and they are offered rehab. So that became very, very difficult to, they had to. They still had some inpatients, and unfortunately, of course, all visitation had to be stopped, and there was only limited visitation allowed for those who were, near end of life. So in that situation, Dakota and her team, they were really concerned about their patients. They knew that they were lonely, they were feeling isolated. Families were really feeling, they were really worried about their relatives in the hospital that they couldn't meet. So they sat down together and they thought about how they could facilitate virtual visits through video calls and, other means and through calls. So they came up with this idea and they came up with a solution where they worked with the patients, their families, and they schedule these calls between patients and their families, trying to keep them connected. So the driving change behind this change was that, this shared experience between the healthcare staff and the patients there. They knew that, it's something that could easily happen to any one of their family members, and that was sort of a shared experience that drove this change. And although it's not the same as having, direct physical visits from families and staff, but it was they got really positive feedback from patients, residents, and families, and it was also a very positive experience for healthcare staff. Where they thought that, they actually made a difference in somebody's day and made them feel better. And the fourth story we have is about conducting rehab assessments and the classes virtually. So this story was shared to us by Chelsea, who's a respiratory physiotherapist who works in an acute hospital. So she also works in a multidisciplinary team. And initially, like all the other organizations and healthcare, hospitals, the main concern was to trying to reduce the footfall and also reduce the risk of infection. So they try to change and how care were delivered and try to make it more virtual delivery. So what happened was that, in their case, last year they had already started working on a solution, considering that for virtual rehab, for pulmonary rehab, there are usually very long wait times. So they were already working on a solution. And when COVID hit, they again reached out to national experts, international experts. So they worked together and they found an app that they could really use to deliver not just the classes, but also do some of their rehab assessments online as well. So use that app where patients could join in from the comfort of their home, and then they could, continue with their care delivery. So, although, patients still do miss the social element of coming in for their, physiotherapy and meeting people and interacting with staff, but they do understand it is for their own safety, and the informal feedback or formal feedback, in this case, they've done an evaluation, and around 97% of the patients, they said that they were quite happy with receiving their care through this virtual method. So this has been quite useful in their case, and they're thinking about that how they can keep using some aspects of this in future as well. These are some of the four stories that we've collected, and now moving on to what's common across these stories. So there are a lot of themes that cut across all these stories. The first one is around anxiety and fear. That COVID is dominating all aspects of work and their personal life as well. And there's a fear for safety. They're concerned about their own safety, the safety of their patients, of their staff, families as well. And so that's a main concern for staff, and that's leading to a lot of anxiety and fear. And to deal with that anxiety and fear, they have been employing certain emotional supports and coping mechanisms. So they've been relying more on other team members, and being open and honest about how they feel and showing vulnerability. And there's a general increase in how their consciousness of being conscious of others, how others are feeling, and taking care of each other. So there's an increased sense of well-being and taking care of each other, and it has become more integrated into the workday. So on the other hand, managers on their own, they're also trying to intervene and try to take care of their be conscious of how people are feeling in their teams, and trying to help them and help them cope with the situation. And based on that, the next thing is that COVID has served as a forcing function for change. For example, it has accelerated and enabled the pace of change, the pace at which change is happening. And it has organizations and staff, they have to be more innovative in their own roles in trying to continue their delivery of care, and they have to think outside the box, think of innovative solutions to keep services going. There are various aspects to that. For example, the approval processes became very quick. There wasn't really any resistance to change. Staff, they were, staff buy-in. Everybody was ready to help and ready to, implement changes. Resources were made available, and generally, it was a very conducive environment for implementing changes and QI. The next thing that was common across these stories was around person-centric changes. So all of these changes, they were guided by the concern for that person, empathy, and compassion. So COVID, like I've talked about it this before, that it's a shared experience, that everyone is vulnerable. And it wasn't about, it was about how we can keep everyone happy, we can keep, keep delivering care, keep everyone safe, everyone who's involved in that service safe. So that was the main concern and driving factor behind these changes. And another important thing that happened was that it introduced staff to a very flexible way of working, which is a new way of working that has led to the flattening of the hierarchy. The focus was always on getting the job done on the task. It wasn't about who was higher in the hierarchy, who was lower in the hierarchy. It was about getting the task done. And a lot of people were redeployed, which meant that people who were coming up into a new team, all of them, they didn't really have any experience in that specific area. So it sort of leveled that for everyone, and it represented a very flexible way of working, which wasn't really the norm in healthcare. So that's a new experience for staff. And then the last thing is around, the staff concern around consolidating the learning from COVID. So it's about a lot of teams have already simulated the changes into their routines. People who were redeployed, they've gone back and they've taken some of their learning with them. But there's concern that, how can we mitigate the risks that COVID has highlighted? And the people are also concerned that, are we going to lose these flexible way of working, and these improved and efficient solutions that we've come up, are we going to lose those solutions in future, or are we going to learn from them? Moving on to the QI and learning from QI stories is that, COVID itself served as an overall shared goal between, across the health system, patients, staff. It was a shared goal, and on an organizational or a team level, each team and organization, they translated that specific goal into a SMART goal, into something that they wanted to achieve into a very specific goal. So that served in facilitating how these rapid changes were implemented. And then I've talked about this before, that small changes leading to big impact. Instead of trying to get looking for perfect solutions, looking for big changes, staff went and teams went in with small changes, and then actually gradually building upon those changes, much similar to how a plan to study act cycle works, that going in and then gradually improving the solution that was being offered. And then another important factor that came out from this was that teams learned to leverage and acknowledge the strengths of team members. They acknowledged that everybody has different strengths and different weaknesses. So rather than, it was important to focus on what that person did well. You acknowledge them, recognize that, and then facilitate that. So that was a very good, that improved their teamwork, and that was a very good way of working. And that was really helpful in implementing and sustaining these changes. So COVID is also a common experience between staff and service users, and that really enabled the engagement and motivation as well. They knew that staff were also really vulnerable how to that entire experience. So it was something that really motivated them to get engaged and get behind these change efforts. Moving on, there was a reduced time spent in planning, and there was more time spent on testing and implementing changes. So it was more of a practical approach rather than thinking about what to do and going through a long process. They just went in and tried to implement the changes, and then gradually refining and refining those solutions. Another interesting thing that we've learned from these stories is that um, generally the barriers that are highlighted in research in relation to QI, such as a lack of engagement from leadership, or maybe resource constraints, and project teams not having the power to make decisions, for example, long approval times and procedures, that was really removed or lessened during COVID-19. So everybody was engaged, right down from the top management to the front line. Everybody was engaged. The resources were made available, and uh, I've talked about how flattening of the hierarchy. So there was managers and leaders. They shared their power with their staff, and they were that enabled staff to make changes and gave them, encouraged them to make those changes as well. So and the approval times and procedures, they were also reduced. So next, I have a few quotes to support the discussion we've had so far. So the first one is around having more efficient solutions during COVID-19. The first one is says that prior to COVID, there was no communication, electronic communication between GPs and primary care, and it was actually quite a barrier for the work. So what happened was that because there wasn't any electronic communication, the communication was very likely to get lost in mail, and that was a bit of a problem. But during COVID, there's a solution that links these two, and that's more efficient as compared to what was being done previously. So COVID has offered some solutions, some of the solutions that are more efficient, or you can say improved solutions, as compared to what was being done normally before COVID. Next, we have a few more quotes in relation to accelerated change processes. So the first one here says, a forcing function with COVID that allowed us to put changes in place that we'd been looking for quite some time. And this is one of many quotes where people have talked about changes that they had been trying to get in for years, but that wasn't really happening. And when COVID came, and all of these changes, they could really got accelerated, and they were able to execute these changes. Then another quote here says, we would have spent a lot more time planning had we had the time, but because we didn't, we just, as I say, put our shoulder to the wheel and got it, I suppose. So it was more about the practical side of doing rather than spending time planning and trying to come up with detailed plans. There wasn't really much time to do that. And then the next quote is that, and then just even then, once you've done 10 swaps, you were the expert and you were expected to teach the next person. So this is a quote for someone who was redeployed in the testing center. And it really highlights that not just the change process was accelerated, but the process of expert development was also accelerated. Once you've moved into a new area, you were expected to quickly learn and then, teach others as well. So that was another aspect of this rapid change. The next quote here says that, we had immediate access to approval for whatever we were trying to do in terms of the work we were doing. I mean, again, these things were done at a far faster pace. Things were approved in an accelerated fashion. So the approval processes that would normally take weeks and months, they were shortened, and now everything was being done at a much quicker pace. Next, I have a few quotes in relation to application of QI methodology. So there are two aspects to that. There were those who went in there who are now reflecting back and thinking that, even though there wasn't really a formal QI thought process going behind their changes, now when they look back, they can see how QI methods were really relevant and that really helped in their application. The first one quote here says that, there hasn't been sort of a formal QI program behind this. In practice, a lot of the sort of QI principles have been applied. So when people are reflecting on these changes retrospectively, they're able to see the relevance of QI methods. On the other hand, there were some projects, for example, the content management program. So that was explicitly driven by the QI methodology. If you look at the next, second, and third quotes, they are from projects that were really explicitly using and following QI methodology. So the first one said that we always kept the QI methodology in the back of our mind. Even from the very beginning, it was very paramount that we were going to adapt, change, try new things, very much along the QI methodology element. And the next one is about, from the beginning, it was very paramount that we're going to adapt, change, try things, and very much along the QA methodology element. So this is, the same quote here as well. Okay, and another element that I've talked about previously was around the person-centeredness, and that was an important element of all the rapid changes that were taking place. So I have one quote here to represent that says that, make sure that clients that are here, any patients that are here, get the best possible care, given the fact that they can't be with their loved ones. We have to try and be their family for now. So that shows a great sense of compassion and empathy. That was also a major part of these rapid changes and QI efforts that were taking place. Moving on to the power of stories, why we've relied on collecting stories. So our observation is that, participants were much more engaged in sharing their experiences and their thoughts when we were talking about, sharing their stories. And the stories actually allowed us to capture the depth of human experience. It allowed us to allowed the participants to mix between their social, personal, and professional perspectives and experiences. It also allowed them to move between the past, present, and future. So that was really important in understanding the QI and changes within this overall experience of COVID. And on another aspect of getting, stories and collecting these stories was that it allowed participants to verbalize and share and express their emotions and feelings, and almost offered a cathartic outlet, which, they were able to share the experience of COVID, which is really helpful as well. And it has really, these stories have really demonstrated that staff can be really involved in, they can take the lead in implementing changes, coming up with innovative ideas, and actually seeing them through to implementation and testing those ideas on their own, which is, a very important outcome. And it also shows that the traditional barriers to QI, a lot of them can be overcome and a lot of them can be bypassed in, the post-COVID as well. Continuing with the theme of stories that we have, they really demonstrated how important it is to listen to the voices of the staff and how it is important to benefit from their insights. They've reflected on their experiences, on personal experiences, and how they think that the organizations can learn and how this can inform the health system in future as well. So it's really important to listen to these voices and incorporate and learn from them. Especially, it's not just restricted to a research point of view. If you look at it from a leadership perspective, it can be a very important leadership tool where leaders can, incorporate, listen to stories, listen to the voices of staff, and use that as a leadership tool and help them in, getting connecting with their staff as well. These stories are also exemplars and they are inspiration for learning for QI work, not just QI work, the training, how people are trained in future and how the direction of the health system and QI priorities are set in future. So and relating it to the framework for improving quality in the health system, so the first thing is that, if you look at the different drivers of leadership, person and family engagement, staff engagement, use of improvement methods, measuring quality and governance, all of these drivers were observed and to different degrees, all of these drivers were observed and they were present in all of these stories, confirming the importance of all these different factors in when trying to implement quality improvement initiatives. And just to conclude that, COVID has served as a propelling force. It has led to a lot of change and it has led to a lot of efficient solutions. But there is a concern among staff that, a lot of these gains might be lost if we don't really think about it at this point and think about how we can learn from this experience and these stories and the experience that has happened so far. So it's important to learn from it to avoid the risk of losing the learning from this. In the end, I do have some resources in relation to the power of storytelling, how it can be used in relation to QI and in generally in health services as well. So if you have any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Zuneera. That was fantastic. Now, what we shall do is, as I said, we shall open the floor now. We'll invite our panelists and Zuneera to answer any of your questions and queries. So when you type into the chat box, make sure that you know when it says to, that you say to everyone. I have to say, Zuneera, you really have touched everybody because, the power of stories. We all have stories to tell from COVID. And I love the line, shoulder to the wheel, because if I heard it once, I heard it numerous times. Just shoulder to the wheel and let's keep going. So
Yeah.
fantastic. Well done. An amazing piece of work. So guys, I'm just going to hand you over now to our panel. So we have John, Vera, Khalil and Aoife.
Well, can I just say thanks also to Zuneera. That was really wonderful, Zuneera. Thank you very much. And maybe on behalf of the panel, I might just congratulate you on putting what kind of seemed at one point something very messy that we didn't really know where these stories were going to go, and I want to congratulate you just on bringing that all together. And I'm reminded, kind of seeing Khalil and Vera there, when we started talking about this, that we knew that stories were going to be an important way of trying to make sense of all of this. And I think collectively, we found each other pretty early on. I think in our shared interest in what we might learn from stories and how it might really help us just make sense of what was going on. I think the uncertainty at the beginning was very difficult here, and I think this was a way of people trying to figure out what to do and how to respond and take away from some of the helplessness. Khalil, what were your early memories of this project starting off, looking for these stories?
Oh, John, to be honest with you, I went back to Twitter in preparation for today just to kind of conjure up those feelings again. And you might remember this very well, but John, you had put out a really beautiful call out to people on the 22nd of March of 2020. And I remember it distinctly because I had just been redeployed working on COVID, maybe a couple of weeks before. And you were on the beach in Clogherhead, if I'm not mistaken, and you said words of, you're looking for examples of good teamwork, of good humanity, of good compassion for others and ourselves. And that just captured me immediately. And certainly in the work that we did in Values in Action and continue to do, storytelling, as we see it, is social proof. It's so important in order to capture, where people are at, what are people experiencing, and then be able to take the good stuff from that and be able to springboard it back into the organization as we look forward today and into the future. So I suppose, it did all start with a tweet in a very everyday, ordinary way, I think, as Vera said earlier today. And by doing that, it was about then picking up the phone to each other as colleagues, having the conversation and saying, for me, when we first spoke, John, was I think you hit the nail on the head. And how can we do this? How can we amplify this? And who else do we need to bring into the fold? So very quickly, you and I were talking about which other parts of the organization we wanted to combine and collaborate with. So that's what it became. And then certainly your connections with UCD and with Aoife and Zuneera and the team. And then all of the hard work that everyone put into it. And certainly also for Sarah Crahan in HSE Values in Action, who did a lot of the project management work on the HSE side. So I'm just so delighted, Zuneera, to have you talk us through everything today. And it's great to see, again, the stories coming to life, but also what we can learn from it.
Thanks, Galila. And Vera, you joined us as well very early on in seeing the importance of story.
Right, Sean. Yeah, at the very early stages there, not long after that tweet. I remember retweeting that tweet and liking it and all of that and thinking, this is a time for all of us in the work that we do in HR and quality and communications, to do what we can, want to do the right thing for our staff, those staff that are at the front line. And I think that's continued over the last 12 months, 14 months. And we're still in that struggle, continuing to do the best we can to support our staff who continue to be on the front lines and to anticipate and prepare for the months ahead also. I suppose what I'm really blown away by is the power of the stories that Zuneera has put forward there, is the pace of change that we seem to have cut through a lot of the red tape. And I think to hold on to that for the future, when things become a little bit more complicated and complex in the months ahead, to come back to this place and say, well, we've done it before. We did it some months back. So going back to our colleagues, going back to our teams, having the trust of our colleagues and our teams and our managers that we can do it because we've done it before and we've proven it. And we've got the trust and the confidence of the public right behind us now, which is fabulous.
And I think there was a shift, I think, early on, at the beginning, it was maybe about the fact that the stories were there to I suppose, buoy other people and lend to that kind of collective sense of we're all in this together. But like you said, Vera, we started to see that we were getting great examples of what was possible when you kind of took some of the barriers, like Zuneera nicely alluded to there, took barriers out of the way. And I remember at one point, I think possibly in April or May last year, Paul Reid making a comment somewhere that he felt we had unblocked the organization, that we had opened up things, and if we could only learn from this, what are the important things that we need to do to keep this going, this way of working going.
Yeah. Well, one thing that strikes me there, if I can come in again, is the use of technology and communication with staff. And I know I'll be talking to my colleague in comms, Emma, about this too, about maybe trying to explore the use of apps more broadly, or technology in general, because we know from previous feedback from staff, people are looking for, I suppose, not everybody has email, so people are looking for simpler, quicker, faster, more to the point ways of being communicated with, because everybody needs information. People want to be in the know, and they want to know the stuff that impacts them in their day-to-day work. But I suppose as a large organisation such as us, we've struggled with getting information and communication out to staff. So I love the idea about the app and how quickly it was developed, and I'd love to explore other ideas along that front, yeah, into the future.
And Aoife, can I ask you just about the idea of maybe taking stories that many of them coming from social media and how you turn that into research?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, John, in terms of the importance of stories for sense making, especially during a time when people didn't have the same communication channels open to them. They weren't meeting in the same ways they used to. So it was a really great way to understand what was happening in the system, but also to understand what was unique to certain maybe parts of the health system and what was shared. So what are the, I mean, I think Zuneera's research is particularly powerful in terms of leveraging people's storytelling to kind of unpick and understand the drivers and the mechanisms behind the success we've seen, and people are very proud of the achievements they've made over the under like extreme circumstances, extreme pressures, and still delivering high quality care, patient care. So I think in terms of turning these tweets into stories, we obviously worked very closely with yourselves in the HSC to identify a cross section of stories across different settings, different contexts, and different types of quality improvement and change efforts to understand, can we collect these stories in more detail through follow-up interviews and to really understand what was driving and helping to support and enable this change.
Great. Great. And Zuneera, have you seen much more of this method of, I suppose, describing the pandemic, you know, using stories? Has it been used in other countries as well?
There have been a few studies. People have been looking into more of, exploring experiences, but not really in the form of stories, which I think is quite unique in the way looking at QIs, especially for me. I'm looking at, these stories from a perspective of QI and trying to understand their overall experience, not just that particular phenomenon that we are interested in. Just being, compassionate and listening to their entire story. So that's something that was a very good learning experience for me as well. And in research, in terms of research, I haven't seen a lot of research during COVID-19 in relation to stories as well. So that's something that's really interesting here. Yeah.
Great, and it's obviously still emerging, I suppose, as a piece of as an area of research. And Khalil and Vera, where do you see kind of maybe the future for some of these stories? Do you think they, as we perhaps move into a different phase of the pandemic now, and kind of people talk about post-pandemic, will these stories still have a value?
Oh, definitely. I think we still, have a piece of work to do in terms of as a group, and kind of saying, okay, with everything and all of the hard work that Zuneera and Aoife and the team have put in, how can we capture all of that and bring that back to leadership, bring it back to the HSC board, and really, really help to inform the future version of the health service as we continue forward. So for me, that is hugely, hugely important that we do provide that information to leadership. And also, I think from, a story gathering perspective, to also feed that back to staff, bring it back to staff, to users of the staff, in order to help, I guess, share that narrative of what was it like for us as a health system facing what we did, because there was so much fear and hope sitting together. Certainly, I think when we started this back in March of 2020.
Great. Vera, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything there Khalil has said. I think there's huge opportunity, and I think it's about just re-emphasizing, remembering to speak to the stories, to draw attention to the stories. They're there, they're documented now. The work is done, or it's has progressed significantly. So it's up to all of us, I think, to use that bank of information and to remind people that it's there, to remind them of the value and the power of a personal story, and to tell it from your perspective, because you were there, you're part of the experience, and let's do more of that into the future. I agree with Khalil also bringing that to the senior leadership as well, and that being seen as a valued methodology and method of gathering information and measuring progress.
I was struck by how many of the stories are so inclusive, and everyone, including patients and families, are in there. And the other thing that struck me, Zuneera, was again the idea of permission, or perhaps that the need for permission was lessened somewhat. Do you think there's a significant lesson for leadership in that? Yeah, I think you're muted there.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, I think that is really important. There have been a lot of lessons in terms of leadership, especially. So on one side, in terms of QI, people have talked about how they've gotten permission, and the approval processes, the long approval processes, they're gone, and the leaders are engaged in their QI projects, which if you look at research on QI, that's one of the problems that is highlighted often, that leadership's not really engaged. They're not fully aware of what QI teams are doing. So that's something that was removed. And secondly, there's a realization among leaders as well, that they're willing to share their power, they're willing to do that, they're willing to step back and let teams handle the situations and try to make decisions as a team, rather than something coming from management or from leadership. So that has also an impact on the how people see these initiatives. It creates more ownership, that they see that it's coming, the initiatives that they are coming up with, they're able to implement, and that creates more ownership as well.
Great. Thanks. And Aoife, this all fits into the collective leadership models, really, doesn't it? And that way of thinking of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, as Zuneera said, it was kind of like a forcing function for teams to work more collaboratively as teams, and leveraging the expertise that was often already there, just people hadn't been aware of it. And I think the power of the storytelling is that it enables teams to have that reflective practice to actually consider how they're working as a team. And previous to COVID, teams that either hadn't had the time for this to meet as a team, or hadn't emphasized or prioritized that. So I think that's another key ingredient for success that we're seeing here as well.
Great. And Zuneera, you only gave us a flavor of your stories there. You have many more stories, isn't that right? And
yeah, so right now I have around 19 stories from 20 people. But I think we've had this discussion with Aoife that we can extend some of that data collection as well, and collect more stories along the same lines. So that's something we can, continue building on.
but like you said, they're kind of all fitting into your model, really. There, that there's a commonality between the stories.
Yes, yeah, there definitely is. I presented those themes, so something that in terms of how the initial thoughts were, there was a lot of anxiety, there was stress, and people didn't know what to expect. But then they dealt with that, and then, they coped with that, used emotional support, coping mechanisms, and they moved ahead with that. And then they tried to make changes, being more person-centered, and trying to work with whatever they had and try to make those changes. So that is common across all these stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Denise, have we any
questions? Okay, so we have Margaret has put up a question that there is a great opportunity to support recovery from our staff in sharing their stories over the coming months and feeling listened to. The sense of ownership and belonging in the organisation has been heard by the organisation, and that will be key. And absolutely, Margaret, I think that's so important, because the one thing as well I would say, Zuneera, from this piece of work is really the power of the stories. It's like the staff are actually, anybody who has given a story, they just feel as though maybe a little bit empowered because they've been listened to, that it's been recorded, and it's part of a really important piece of research. I think it's fantastic, so, and yeah, absolutely, it will just, if it's heard by our leaders, our senior management, it really does show that things can change and things will change. Anyone else there? We're almost finishing up. If anybody else has any more questions, please put them in. There's not that many today, and usually we find that if we have a very I suppose engaging talk, you know, people are so engrossed in listening, they don't perhaps type. But I suppose even for me, you know, that this, you know, we were all impacted with redeployment, and it's great to see that that's being focused on, because, you know, one day we're here and the next day we're doing something completely different, and in 3 days we become an expert, you know. And so, and I think everybody has that COVID experience to share, because it affects everybody, both at home and at work. And I really think that's so important that that has been captured in this, you know, because everybody has a story to tell. Well, let me see. Okay, so I'd say that's really it. We might just move on. Zuneera, thank you so much. And I'm really, really looking forward to, you know, when it's this whole bit of research is put together fully, is in sitting down and reading it, you know, because everybody, I think, can see themselves in the stories, you know, so which is really, really important. So thank you so much. What I'm going to, just before we leave, I've 2 important pieces to mention, and one of them also, you know, is related to Zuneera's work. But just before we get into that, what we want to do is let us know how we did today. So we have a short feedback form after the session, and it really will helps us how we can improve our QITalktime webinars. So just before logging out, a window will pop up with a few short questions, and we'd really, really appreciate if you just give that few minutes to fill it out for us. Now, here's a very exciting slide. Okay, so what Zuneera has shared with us today is part of a winning idea from the Q Exchange. So the Q community is, I suppose, it's a connected community with over 4,500 people with a passion in QI. And they put out a call for, you know, ideas, and 2 of the winning ideas came from Ireland. And one of those is harnessing learning from staff experience of QI during COVID-19. And so Aoife, John, Maureen and Zuneera is part of this. And the great news is that they are receiving now funding. So they're going to take this idea further. So, which is great, because we can see, you know, our own voice is being heard in this piece of work, which is really, really important. So the Q community, guys, if you are interested in joining this Q community, you can go online, and I have the link is there, and we will put the link up, but I mean, you can just Google Q community and you'll find it. And what you can do is, when you're in there, is how can you apply. So there's a huge section on it, on how you apply. And what they ask you to do is they will ask you to complete a very simple questions and a little piece of work on your knowledge and what your commitment and community is. And you can then submit on their online portal and to join the Q community. And if you need any help, Caroline Lennon-Nally on our own team is fantastic. So she is your link. So please feel free to email Caroline at caroline.lennonnally@hsc.ie. And she will help you on your application to apply for the Q community. Within 6 weeks, then usually they will get back to you, and you'll get a lovely little package with a nice little Q community badge to say you remember. And it's just, let's keep that community growing. So that's really it for us today. Just to say a huge thank you to Zuneera and our panel. Fantastic, great work is being done. You know, remember, we are not being forgotten as staff on the front line, and everything that you've done, everything you've experienced, it's being captured. So I think that's one of the most important pieces, is that the real hard work that we've done, it has not been forgotten. So next up then, we have another QI, which is talk time. We have 2 more coming up. So we have on the 18th of May, we have a conversation with Dr. Amar Shah. So Dr. Shah is the Chief Community Officer of East London NHS and also the National Lead on Quality with the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK. QI is a passion of his, and we will be having a lovely conversation with him. Following that, on the 1st of June, we have Dr. Kieran Walsh from the British Medical Journal in London, and he's going to speak to us on clinical decision support and QI and the challenge of comorbidities. So he then that's another opportunity for everybody to, you know, learn more about how quality improvement really does impact on the work that we do. Remember, we're on Twitter at QITalktime, and don't worry that, you know, we record all our webinars. They will go up on our website, which is the QITalktime website, so you can watch us back. And also all the slides, you know, you'll be able to open up all the slides and have a look, and all Zuneera's resources, all the information and on the work that she's done is there. So that's on it for today. Just to say thank you so much to everybody. Again, a huge thank you to our panelists, for everybody for giving up their time. And we now can let you all go off for a little bit of lunch. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.